All right. Right. Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon. Good morning to those of you who are joining us on Pacific time. We are going to get started here in just a moment. We're excited to welcome folks to this, which is my first opportunity to do a live stream. So I'm excited to be doing something new as I talk about and share this new project that we are working on, which is so near and dear to my heart. So we're gonna settle in and get started in just a moment. So welcome everyone. Welcome. All right, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to start on time. One of my favorite quotes from Malcolm X, which he may or may not have said, was that as soon as he left prison, he said, "The first thing that I bought was a watch because I did so much time. I want to stay on time." So we are going to get started. My friends, I want to invite you for the next little bit of time to take this journey with me, where we're going to um, be talking about ways in which we can save our boys of color. And if you have had an opportunity to spend any time with me, you know that this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This has been my heart's work, my life's journey for many years, as long as I can remember. Been really thinking about and focusing on and imagining ways in which we can serve Black and Latino boys really well. And so I came to that from uh, looking at some of my doctoral work about 12 years ago, really having a sharp set of people in my tribe around me that were really asking me to articulate that which has been on my heart. And so the title of my dissertation was "We Can Save Our Boys of Color." And so that framed into what would be my dissertation. And if you've had any experience with academic work, you know that when we write in the academy, we're not writing necessarily for all of the people. And so it took me a while, now over a decade, to really shape and mold some of that language so that I could actually present it out in a digestible form to the people. And so that's where we are now. And so I'm excited to announce the upcoming book, "We Can Save Our Boys of Color." It'll be part one of two, where we're going to actually look at some of the practices that I'm going to talk about today and put them out in a first version so we can digest it and have conversation and movement and implementation of those. And then we're going to release the second book shortly thereafter. But this work that we're talking about, "We Can Save Our Boys of Color," for me is really um, situated inside of a real understanding that we've known for a long time that our boys of color are in danger. Our Black and Latino boys are in danger. They have been for as long as I can remember. In early days of some of my own development in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about a crisis, and that looking at our Black and Latino boys as an endangered species. And while that certainly raises the alarm clock, raises the alarm on the situation, what some of us who are close to the work knew that we weren't, while we were using language like endangered, we weren't giving attention, as much attention as we would to a species who's endangered. And so what we want to do is continue to shine the spotlight on this important population. And so, with that said, as I pull up the PowerPoint, I want to just share this landing slide is one that I think is interesting. I've got a background um, in trauma. My experience in trauma is one that I share. I share pretty frequently and openly. And so when I think about being a young man of color, a young Black and brown man, I really think about some of my early experiences in my most thundering years. And so myself as a 16-year-old was really at the height of some of my most difficult times. And so when we're thinking about we can save our boys of color, the idea is looking back as well as looking forward. That Sankofa, that notion of looking back in order to understand going forward. I look back in my own journey. And what I needed were, and I had some and I needed more, I needed people who were dedicated to saving my very life. And I was able to thread this world and my life trajectory through very precarious situations and barely make it. And so I think about that as we think about this work. And so this picture of me is when I was 16. I smile because it was shortly thereafter that I would meet the love of my life, my very best friend, Dr. Christina Watlington. So she remembers this young man, and some other folks who know me really well and have known me for a long time remember this young man. And so it was also here that I was living two worlds, a paradox, if you will. That while I was still very committed to experiencing the world in a way that wasn't necessarily helpful, I recognized that what Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folk in 1906, what he said was, how does it feel to be a problem? He asked that question. He was talking about black men in the United States. How does it feel to be a problem? And I recognized that I was a problem for my family. I was a problem for my community. I was a problem for the schools. And that none of them quite knew how to experience me and how to support me in the most optimal way. While at the same time, I was already developing a sense of consciousness where I would decide that my life work would really be about supporting and developing and trying to give life to my people. And so I was walking this paradox where I was at once subtracting from and taking away from the community, while at the same time trying to and wanting to pour into the community. And so here I am, many, many, many years later, over 30 years later, still trying to do the same thing. So we can save our boys of color. When I say save our boys of color, I'm not leaning into rhetoric. I'm not leaning into hyperbole. I'm really talking about saving their very life. Because what we know about many of our boys of color is that what they are experiencing in the world is not life-saving, is not experiencing the world in a way that is oriented towards their optimal conditions. And so my research years ago, and much of it still holds true now, is that there are some really devastating statistics. And I'll just put some up here and let them sit with you for a moment. What I ask is, as these are showing up, which of them gives you the most heartache? Which breaks your heart the most? And so I want to invite us to be interactive, to have a conversation, right? I come from the Black tradition where we speak with each other, right? So use the chat and jump in here and offer a little bit of feedback around which of these really breaks your heart the most. And certainly all of them do, but there's some that jump out to me in various stages of my own development and journey as an activist, as an educator, as a father. I really think about only 3.5% of college students are Black boys, 42% of all homicide victims. And so these are statistics, and statistics speak to our head, but stories really speak to our heart. But if you write anything else down, I really want you to write down on your heart the number 39, 39. Because 39 is really powerful. In the research that I was doing for my dissertation, and therefore ultimately showing up in the book, is that when we think about some of the experiences for our Black and brown boys, What is the value of education? Here's what's interesting. The average life expectancy for a Black man without his high school diploma is 39 years. The average life expectancy for a Black man with his high school diploma is 59 years. 69 with a higher education, and 77 years, just for comparison purposes, for white women with higher education. So what's really interesting is when we start talking about what is the value of the diploma, what is the value of this piece of paper, right? We can monetize it in terms of sort of, some capitalist principles around, contributions to the economy and draw down on, on supports from the government, et cetera. But we can put it in real concrete terms that I think we can all really understand. The value of that high school diploma is 20 years of life. 20 years of life. By having that high school diploma, on average, we increase the life expectancy for Black men in the United States by 20 years. And so when I think about this work of saving their lives, I'm thinking about actually saving the lives, not just getting young men to increase their test scores, not just marching them to career and college readiness. What I'm really talking about is how can we intervene, do the good work that we need to in order to save their very lives. Now, this is personal for me because I have been a leader in alternative environments and in traditional school environments for many, many years. And what I have had the significant experience of is watching and hearing about too many of our young Black and brown males dying. And so every single time it hits me like a truck, and I was never prepared for it. Over the past 12 years or so in the alternative schools in which I've helped to lead in Delaware, we have lost somewhere around 17 young men, all of them Black and Latino boys, all of them to homicide. And so when I think about we can save our boys of color, I'm thinking about Raheem, about Anthony, about Ronald, about Aki, about Carlos, and the names go on and on. Each of these young men were in my life for a moment. And I hope that I offered something to them, but I also recognize that they died on my watch, that they joined the ancestors prematurely, that I think about could we have done something more in order to create the conditions inside of them, to create the basis for change internally and the conditions and context for change externally? Could we have saved their very lives? And so I think about this work and I think about them and the work that we need to do as I look back on them. I also, though, think about saving the very lives of young Black and brown boys and how it's so heartfelt, because one of my favorite pictures in the world is this one here. This young man looking at the camera is my son, Siddiqui Hassan Jeffrey Muhammad. He'll give you his whole name. And this was at the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March. And Siddiqui and I went down, and as he was heading back from looking at some books, I took this picture. And this pulls at my heart, because this pulls into frame the very picture of a beautiful spirit, of a young Black man who knows who he is and wants to make a positive contribution to his world. And that part of doing this work is saving the world for him and saving him for the world. And so for me, this work is not just about those young men that we've lost, but also those beautiful conditions in which we can create so that they can optimally contribute to the world. Can we save them so that they can give to the world all that they have to give? I believe that we can. In order to do so, though, we must acknowledge that there's been a tremendous amount of time, effort, some of it conscious, some of it unconscious, much of it conscious, towards them not doing really well. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, he introduced to the world in popular form what is considered the Erickson rule. Erickson, as a sociologist, and he popularized this notion of 10,000 hours. So many of us are familiar with it. The 10,000 hour rule goes something like this, that how long does it take to master something, right? And so in the book Outliers, he talks about the Beatles, and I often give a reference to Michael Jackson and the difference between the Jackson 5 and the Thriller album, right? 10,000 hours of practice to master something. Well, how does that apply here? What I'd like to suggest is that that rule can really give us a framework by which we can understand what might be going on holistically with some of our boys. How long does it take? If we take an average school day of 7 hours, a traditional school year of 180 days, and 8 years of negative credentialing, that's that Victor Rios term that he popularized in the book Punished, policing the lives of Black and Latino boys. And we multiply all those together, 7 hours a day, 180 days a year, 8 years, then many of our Black and Latino boys reach 10,000 hours by the time they are in 7th grade. This makes strong sense, especially when we look at the data nationally and we see that what is the height, what is the apex of much of the negative experience for many of our boys, especially when they're getting arrested inside of schools, right? Sent down that school to prison pipeline, we see that it is coalescing most often in middle school. We see that that is the heights of many of the alternative placements, being kicked out of school, being locked up for many of our Black and Latino boys. Why? Because they've hit 10,000 hours, or more appropriately, we've hit 10,000 hours with them. We have mastered not serving them well. They have mastered not being served well. Now, those are just school hours. If we combine, integrate also what's going on in the community, what's going on at home sometimes, where it's not life-giving always, then many of our young boys reach 10,000 hours way before 7th grade. And we see that that is so true inside of our work. So if we're going to really face this call to facing this challenge of saving our Black and Latino boys, we've got to look soberly at what is happening. 10,000 hours, yes, but what is the ownership responsibility that we have? I do not believe that we can seriously engage in this work around saving our boys of color if we do not take ownership of what is happening. And with that said, the ownership reflection is recognizing, as I said earlier, that they've been dying, they've been failing, they've been struggling on our watch. Right? That if we're really going to look at this, what I've had to do is recognize that I too have contributed, that I might not have done all that I can, and that our common strategies, the things that we've been throwing at them, the things that we've been doing, have either not worked or they've worked too well. For instance, if our strategies have been to alienate, to isolate, to ostracize, to stigmatize, then those strategies have been best practices in how we have created environments for our Black and brown boys. But contrarily, if we have been working hard to try to save their lives, we have to acknowledge and admit that far too often our strategies have not worked. And then the last thing is really this question of, do we have the courage to focus on our boys of color? Now, I keep this statement in here, do we have the courage? But I've outgrown that question already, because I do not believe that that this work really takes courage. I don't. I used to, because it would pat me on the back. It would cater to my ego that yes, I have the courage to focus on our Black and brown boys. I don't believe that it takes courage anymore. I believe that it just takes an acknowledgement of the notion of triage. You see, triage says that not everyone's needs are equal, that not everyone has an equity lens, right? Is that we need to meet people where they are, and we need to devote and orient our best resources, our talent, our energy towards those who need us most. And the data remains crystal clear about who seems to need us the most within the context of our school environments. And that, of course, is many of our Black and brown. And so I don't believe that it takes courage. I really believe that it takes this notion of triage. Are they worthy of being seen for the needs in which they have? And so when we think about this as our ownership, let's turn a little bit, right? Let's talk about a guiding theory. What you're going to see throughout the book and much of what you'll see that I mentioned here today is really rooted inside of a guiding theory. And that guiding theory is that the challenges of our boys of color can only be solved by courageous, maybe, determined activists, right? People that are really going to be interested in getting this work done and doing it in a most revolutionary way, using specialized and combined alternative practices. What I'm saying here, these are academic words. What I'm saying here is that we need a comprehensive plan for a complex problem. We need to stop thinking that one thing is going to solve the challenges with our boys of color. That one thing, that one silver bullet, one magic pill is going to solve everything. We need to stop that now. There is no magic pill. There is no silver bullet. But what we can do is we can construct an integrated plan that synergizes together multiple interventions, multiple approaches, especially those that are non-traditional, where we can actually weave them together to cure and save our boys of color. That is what I'm arguing for. That's what you're going to see in the book. That's what I'm putting forward. And so with that, when we think about the starting 6, when I started this work, it was 5, and brilliant thinkers like my brother, Dr. Yasser Payne out of the University of Delaware, when we were doing this work around the dissertation, his voice was in my ear and really encouraging me to make sure that the work was rooted and grounded inside of what was going on with folks in the community and on the street. And so we've now identified a 6th practice. So here's our starting 5. The first is single gender environments. 2nd, restorative practices. 3rd, mental health supports. 4th, innovative mentoring. 5th, rites of passage. And 6th is activism. So this 6th one we've added because some important things were happening on the ground out in the world since I wrote my dissertation. And so what we found is that activism is an important and critical part of how we might be able to save our boys of color. Not just the activism that we do, but the activism that we awake inside of them. And so this first book is really about these first 3: single gender environments, restorative practices, and mental health supports. Each of them with their own take and own spin, oriented specifically for our boys of color. And so the second book will really be digesting innovative mentoring, rites of passage, and activism. All of these practices come right back to a formula that we in Akaben have been putting out into the ether and really trying to see if it can catch inside of the hearts of people. And that formula is right here. Connection plus challenge equals change. Connection plus challenge equals change. Again, write that on your heart, because we've yet to find contrarian evidence to the universal truth of this formula. Connection plus challenge as twin ingredients for change. Connection and challenge are equal parts, with connection being the first among equals. And so these practices are rooted inside of that. Connection plus challenge. How do we connect? And then how do we leverage that connection to challenge in order to bring about the kind of revolutionary and substantive significant change that we want to see in the world, inside of these young men and inside of the communities in which they live? And so let's unpack a little bit of each of these, right? And then I want to open it up for some questions. I'm seeing folks all in the chat. I want you to feel free, throw some questions in there as we're talking, because we're going to have a dialogue together. And so as we begin to unpack, let's start with what I believe is the most controversial: single gender environments. Now, this picture is one that makes me smile, because this was the first graduating class of Prestige Academy. It was an amazing environment, the first single gender charter environment specifically designed for Black and brown boys in the state of Delaware. Believed in it so much that we pulled our son when he was attending one of the best public schools in the state of Delaware so that he could attend this charter school to be with his brothers. And so Prestige Academy is one of those special places. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. But Prestige Academy was one of those special places in which it was intentionally designed for our boys, specifically for our boys of color, Black and brown boys, so that they would have a special place. You see, single gender environments are one of the most controversial because it ranges on a continuum of questions that I find to be almost absurd, like why should we pull our boys just in environments for themselves, as though we don't specialize environments all around the world. For instance, my example here is cancer treatment centers. If you boycott, if you are against single gender environments, I want you to be the first one to also rail against cancer hospitals that are specialized environments designed to focus on a very specific and specialized problem. If you believe that they should exist, then aren't our boys also worth it as well? Having a special environment with them in mind. All the way to the other side of the continuum, an important question asked by a brilliant thinker, Pedro Noguera, Dr. Noguera, and he says that what is it that needs to happen inside of single gender environments for them to actually be different, right? That there may not be magic that happens just because we separate the boys from the girls. And while I agree with Pedro, what I'd like to suggest is that it's inside of these environments that we can actually create and craft the foundation, the milieu, right? The environment, the milieu for all of the rest of the techniques. Now, specialized environments does not mean that it has to be a school like the Prestige Academy was, like Eagle Academy, right? Or Urban Prep. It doesn't necessarily have to be a school. What we want to do, though, is we want to create environments with intention. For instance, it could be a classroom, like I started when I was teaching in Baltimore City, inside of a public school. You see, it can be done. It can be a program, an after-school activity. It could be a counseling group. Let us, though, commit to finding spaces where our boys can come together and see each other, create safety, vulnerability, and feel that we're taking their plot in life very seriously. What specialized environments or single gender environments do is that they also allow us to have targeted treatment and intervention based on gender-based research, right? That I don't know if the science is necessarily there about girls and boys learning differently. I don't even think that needs to be the basis for what we're arguing for here with single gender environments. What I'd like to suggest, though, is that there's something that happens inside of these environments as testified by those who have taught and those who have learned in those environments that allow us to actually do some things that are different, right? And so these specialized moments allow us to have the groundwork for us to be able to do some of the remaining 5 techniques, practices, approaches, if you will. So single gender environments, I'd like to offer that as the first of 6. I go into much more detail, offering some hands-on experiences by those who have built and experienced single gender environments themselves. Let's go to number 2, and that is restorative practices. Now, restorative practices is something that I have been intimately involved with for a number of years since I've had the words, and years before that when I didn't have the words and I just had some practices and some notions. And so restorative practice is important because what it gives us is a way, a pathway by which we can bring and call our boys of color into the community and then create spaces by which we can work through and reconcile harm when it happens. Harm that they do and harm that we do to them. Let me see if I can make sense of this. The preeminent structure in restorative practices is the social discipline window. If you spend 5 minutes with me, you know that I love talking about the social discipline window. I'm not going to break it all down now, but the social discipline window is that intersection between challenge and connection. There's the formula again. You see it, right? And so we've got spaces in which we don't show up with challenge or connection, low challenge, low connection. We call that the not box. We have the 2 box where it's high challenge, low connection. We have the 4 box, which is low challenge, high connection. And then, of course, we have the optimal box, high challenge, high connection. The data is crystal clear. In every environment in which we see our boys of color, our Black and Latino boys, in a traditional sense, we are operating from the 2 box. The data around discipline disproportionality signals that when we look at many of our black and brown boys, that we believe that they are objects to be controlled, to be punished, to be misrecognized and misunderstood, sometimes to even criminalize their play. And so what restorative practice does is it gives us a framework by which we can see ourselves. The social discipline window is a window by which we can see the world, and it's also a set of mirrors by which we can see ourselves. And so this gives us a framework. But also one of the most popular things in restorative practices is the circle. And so when we think about the circle, and I've talked about this at length in other environments, when we think about the circle, we need to recognize that we as practitioners do not bring the circle, especially to communities of color. Our boys of color do not need us to bring the circle to them because they have developed something called the cipher. You see, the cipher is this amazing indigenous site of interaction and energy. So when we think about it, right, it's this cyclical exchange of energy. You know what a cipher looks like, right? A cipher is that thing that we see on the street corners. The cipher is what we see on the playgrounds. A cipher is what some people do when they push somebody in the middle of a circle at a wedding, and that person just goes off and dances and does their own thing. It's a cyclical exchange of energy. It is a street-based bonding practice. Thank you, Dr. Payne, for giving me language in order to understand our own culture and raise it to the level of being worthy of analysis at the academic level. It's a street-based bonding practice. It is an indigenous site of connection. We don't give the circle to them. They've developed the circle themselves. And then lastly, it is a dynamic free expression and synergy. So a cipher is this powerful, magical thing that comes up from the culture of the people, including our boys of color. And if we really have eyes to see and a heart to feel and ears to listen to, we'll recognize that there are rules inside of the cipher that if we pay attention to them, we can actually pull them forward and actually enliven the energy inside of our own restorative circles. What do I mean by rules of the cipher? Here are a few. Only one person has the floor at a time. That one must be invited or embraced by the collective. That everyone contributes no matter how small. Imagine if our classrooms look like that, right? That challenging another is acceptable, that contributions determine length. And the cardinal rule of the cipher is that authentic and freestyle participation. You must come off the top of your dome. You must move your body in the way it feels like it should be moved. You must create music that is authentic and from your heart. It's not scripted. It's not cleansed and sanitized through systems of what's going to be acceptable or popular, that it has to be authentic. This is something that the people, our boys and others, have actually developed themselves. What if we learned from them? What if instead of inviting them to our circle, we actually showed up in the world where they would invite us into theirs? That we flow with the rhythm of the collective and that we celebrate each other. And so the book is really breaking some of these down and seeing how we might be able to apply these practices, right? Developing a mindset and a heart set where we can actually look at our boys of color, not through deficit lens, but through strengths-based, and understand and see that they have value and they give value to the world. And then we might be able to learn something from that. That's what restorative practices can do, the proactive part, not just the responding to harm. And then the last one of the approaches that we're going to focus on is mental health supports. And this is a powerful picture from Tupac. And what I love is that this line in that Tupac gives us, and that is, dying inside, but outside you're looking fearless. Now, my colleague chin checked me a little bit. Melanie Kai Bell, shout out to you. She said, Malik, I'm feeling some kind of way because you're using this about our boys, but this is one of those special moments where Tupac was actually acknowledging the emotional pain inside of women, particularly mothers, right? And so, Melanie, I think you're so right. So I'm borrowing it here to talk about our boys, but we know that it so much applies to what's going on with Black and brown girls and women as well. But this notion of dying inside, but outside you're looking fearless. There's an abundance of emotional pain that our boys carry with them. I don't have to look very far. I can look just back in time at myself. And the time in which I was doing the worst in the world, making the most harm, was that moment in which I felt, those moments in which I felt the most alone and I felt the most in emotional pain, even though I did not have words to express it. Dr. Christina Watlington says that in the absence of a strong emotional vocabulary, we all resort to our behavioral vocabulary. And so this is true for many of our boys of color, that what we don't always have are the words to express and articulate our emotional pain. And so what mental health supports do for our boys is that they give us the opportunity to really get inside of the stuff, inside of them, inside of us. But I want to do more than suggest, I want to put forward and argue that these mental health supports must look at them at the center, right? And what I think too often happens is that we are not thinking about and considering our Black and brown boys when we are approaching them with mental health supports. Too often we are asking them to show up in a way that is not necessarily aligned with their masculine selves and their full selves. And so therefore we're creating blockages and barriers to access for them to access mental health supports. What I'm saying is that what we really need to think about is that some of the challenges here is that our boys of color are often seen as the other, to be controlled, to be feared, to be weaponized. Shut up and dribble is what I'm talking about, right? That there's hyper-masculinity, toxic masculinity as self-protection, right? That I'm going to put on the armor and I'm going to go aggressive, right? In the absence of knowing what to do. And because this keeps others away from me. It's the fight mentality that we know is true in survival mindset. That there's cultural mistrust. It was, I think it was David Chappelle, he said, listen, having a healthy dose of paranoia in America is a healthy thing for a Black man. And so what we do know is that too often mental health providers have misrecognized, misdiagnosed many of our Black and brown boys. So there's cultural mistrust by them and from some of their parents and families. But there's also this notion that we'll outgrow it like asthma, right? That boy, he doesn't need anything. He just feeling bad about his daddy, or, just give him some time, that he'll just outgrow it like asthma, when in fact that isn't the case. That pain doesn't just naturally dissipate, that it calcifies and it turns and it transforms into something else. Too often it transforms into intergenerational traumatizing, right? And then the last one is that we rely sometimes on the informal when what we need is professional support and help. That sometimes the brothers in the barbershop ain't gonna get it done. Their guidance, their wisdom might just not be enough, right, to help out little Malik when he's struggling with some of the emotional pain that he's going through. We might need, and often do need, some professional support. So what are the things that we really need to be thinking about? We need it to be collective based, right? That our boys are, and all of us, right? That harm happens in relationships, so healing must happen in relationships. Again, thank you, Dr. Watlington, for that gem. That there's something about walk and talk therapy that we need to be moving and supporting at the same time. I'm thinking about my colleague, this amazing practitioner, Joshua Lee, who's all about movement, that we've got to move it in order to let it go through us, right? That there's something about that. Joshua said one time that, to paraphrase him, he said that when we are emotionally dysregulated, that we might need to go mechanical. And for me, I interpret that is that sometimes moving the body, walking this journey into manhood as shoulder to shoulder instead of face to face, is often the opportunity and the journey for many of our boys. And then it needs to be psychoeducation. We need to be able to teach what's going on with the brain so that they understand that you are not crazy, that you're feeling something. This is what it feels like. And so helping them to understand and giving the education around what's going on, that's what I believe is really at the root of many of our mental health supports that we need to be supporting. So the three practices that we have really are, that we're going to really unpack in this book, and I want to have a dialogue now, is really looking at single gender environments, restorative practices, and mental health supports. Those three are going to be our first 1, 2, 3 punches as we talk about We Can Save Our Boys of Color. They're going to lay the foundation for the next three in the next book around rites of passage, innovative mentoring, and activism. So with that, I want to pause. I want to open it up. I want to have a conversation with some folks around some questions and see what we might be able to build together. All right, so we're pulling up a question or two here. Okay, so this first question, what would you consider special about pulling our boys together in single gender environments? And what about the girls? What about the girls? Yeah, so I think this idea of crafting special places for our boys gives us that opportunity to really think about what some of their needs are. It also quiets some of the noise that shows up, especially in our adolescent boys, when girls are around, right? Girls are not the problem at all, right? But what happens is that there's some behaviors, there's some mindsets, there's some other stuff that happens oftentimes in the presence of girls that when we can quiet some of that noise, it allows us to actually begin to focus in on what some of their needs are. I'm also a big proponent of single gender environments with co-ed teachers. I think our boys need female teachers so that they can understand how to interact. I think that our girls need male teachers as well. So what about the girls? Listen, um, uh, the work that we have around girls, especially black and brown girls, is critically important. This is not a zero-sum game, right? That there are real powerful practitioners. Dr. Monique Morris, Dr. Christina Watlington has done focused work around many of our girls. And so I want to lean into the leadership of those practitioners and other women who will be able to let us know what needs to happen and how we can support the work for girls. I'd like to be honored to have a voice in what happens to some of our boys as well. So we're not leaving the girls behind. We're actually really thinking about what can we create as a special place for many of our girls as well. So we think about another question. What is the role of white and female adults in doing this work for our boys of color? Yeah, that's a good one. That's a question that I often get. Listen, if we know if the stats still hold true that about 85% of teachers in the United States, at least within this context, are white women, right? That the vast majority of those who are going to be interfacing with our boys of color are going to be white women. And if we add on, white men on top of that, right, then we're getting into the 90% or so. So what is their role, right? We don't have a plan, right, where only black teachers and black male teachers can teach our students. That just does not realistically make sense, right? So what is the role of how many of our white colleagues, male and female, can really get into this work? Well, first of all, there's an African proverb, and it says that one does not abandon your part of the battlefield just because it has thorns. One does not abandon your part of the battlefield just because it has thorns. This work is thorny. And so for our white colleagues who are committed to doing this work, right, what we have is, one is to recognize that this is your part of the battlefield. This is where you find yourself right now. So therefore, doing this good work, finding opportunities for the boys to pull together, finding ways in which we can practice restorative practices, finding mental health support specifically designed with our boys of color in mind, right? Then looking to your left and right simultaneously and pulling into the work those black male, especially, and Latino male practitioners that may not be in your school, that may be excluded from your school environment, finding them so that you can weave them into the work and learn from them as well. We think that the reality of this work is going to require all of us to be able to do it, right? If we're going to combat that's 10,000 hours. This work is really for everyone. These are good questions. All right. It's so hard to find black and Latino therapists. Do you have any guidance for how we can implement gender-relevant mental health supports for our boys of color? Yeah, this one is hard. I smile because I've got a few brothers in my tribe and in my queue, and they are like a unicorn. Dr. Dwayne Thomas, I'm talking about you, and Dr. George Leary, and brother Dr. Yasser Payne, right? Talking about you all. Y'all are unicorns because you are black male therapists with counseling backgrounds that are really dedicated to serving this population. So what happens if we can't find a unicorn? What happens, right? I think what we want to do is ask, require, demand, teach, educate those therapists that are involved in mental health supports and work with our young men to really be thinking about and considering how their best practices, whether that's cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, dialectical behavioral therapy, whatever it is, how are they thinking about them, tooling them, imagining them for this black or brown young man. So in the absence of having a therapist, and by the way, just because you might have a black or Latino male therapist doesn't necessarily mean that they are also oriented towards serving black and brown boys. So we want to ask that of our therapists. In the meantime, we also need to be thinking about some best practices, right? Like walk and talk therapy. We need to be thinking about how do we move young men in order to help their emotions and body move through it. And so there are some powerful practitioners who are doing this work. I mentioned Joshua Lee as well, who's on our team at Aquaban. And so I really want to invite people to be thinking about how we might be able to incorporate in movement and psychoeducational work inside some of the mental health supports. Yeah, these are good. These are good. Um, all right, there it is. How is your work addressing the problem of toxic masculinity? Wow. So to some degree, a hot button topic on something that really shouldn't be, right? I think that every behavior that we have called toxic masculinity isn't such, and I also believe that there are some behaviors that are just antithetical to healthy functioning inside of our community. And so uh, I'd like to let you know that when I'm thinking about this in the book, I'm really looking at um, and trying to name what we would call toxic masculinity as often a protective mechanism, putting the shell up, hardening, sometimes showing aggression, showing my teeth because I feel like I have to. Um, Having many, many, many examples that force brings about change that I want in the world, right? That if I can dominate a situation, a conversation, that often brings about the kind of exertion of my will. And so those are problematic. And so I think that we need to not condemn those who show them, right? Let us condemn the sin, not the sinner, right? Let us separate the deed from the doer. And so toxic masculinity is a behavior, not necessarily something that lives inside of our young men. And so what I want to suggest is that we're thinking about kind of this work. And so when we think about this work, we really, really, really want to make sure that this is seen as what it is. It's a negative coping mechanism that we want to make sure that we address head on through connection and challenge. We will never be able to help our young men change out of some toxic masculine behavior if we don't connect with them. All right. Here's another question came in. What are your thoughts around how we develop rights for our boys when many of us adults, actually, we need to go back to that question. Um, develop rights for our boys when many of our adults did not undergo any kind of structured rights ourselves. Yeah. So we talk about that. We're going to talk about that more in the second book where we focus in on rites of passage. But yeah, so some of this is imaginative work, right? If we ourselves didn't go through a rites of passage, an articulated rites of passage program, a structured program, then some of this is imaginative work around what we think we can create for the needs of many of our young men. Um, and it's not too late, right, for many of us to go through structured, informal, or so rites of passage work. In fact, many of the men that I talk to as they're going through this transformative journey and doing some of the inner work, that is in many ways a rite, right? We're doing a literal or figurative walkabout, right, where we're going out into the world, trying to separate ourselves from the world sort of psychologically in pseudo separation in order to understand ourselves a little bit better. We don't do that in isolation. We're never alone. We're always in the community, even if it's just with our ancestors. And so we're going to talk more about rights in the second book. But I've got about 25 years of experience working and developing some rites of passage programs that we're going to we're going to talk a little bit more about in the second book. Yeah. Yeah, Dwayne, I see a message here about referencing Dr. Howard Stevenson's book, Playing with Anger. Thank you for bringing that up. That's powerful. You and I both know how dope Dr. Stevenson is and the work that he does. That is, I thank you for calling him into the conversation as well. And I think that, you know, when we, Sean, I see what you say here. The most powerful or wonderful flowers can have thorns. That's right, right. Some of it is protective. It's also to let the world know that you got something here that's special. You ought not mess with it, right? Yeah, yeah. I'm interested as we begin to land the plane here. I'm interested to hear what are some of the things that I've mentioned that are really hitting people. What's something that you're looking forward to in the book? Yeah, good. Big brother Shaw, thank you. The imaginative work. Yes, one's lens can be shaped by what they need. That sometimes we have to imagine, do the work of science fiction, right? Speculative fiction around what it is that they may need, and then help to create that, bring that into reality. Yeah. So as a few more people chime in here around what might be hitting you with the upcoming book, my hope, my wish is that that this can simply just add a little bit to the conversation and a guidebook perhaps on our journey towards explicitly and consciously serving our Black and brown boys. I believe that they need the very best that we have to offer. And I don't believe that they've always gotten that from me. And so this is as much a call to myself. The word Akkoben, which one of my companies is named after. The word Akkoben is an ancient Adinkra symbol. It's a war horn, and it's calling to the community to come out and serve. And so as we sound the Akkoben to call and invite folks to come out and serve, I'm sounding that really for myself, to reinvigorate, to re-inspire the work that needs to be done, and some of it with my own hands, with my own mouth, with my own heart, my own feet, and I want to invite all of you as well to joining us on this journey. We're going to be releasing the book in the fall. That's the intention, and then inviting people into conversations. Between now and then, we're going to have a few more things that are going to be released. We did an amazing cipher with about 9 or 10 young men, middle school young men that were graduating in our Student Champion program, led by none other than Siddiqui Muhammad, who facilitated that experience. And so we're going to release a video of that so you can see some of the interaction with talking to young men about these exact same things to understand what some of their needs are. We're also going to be having a few more conversations with some practitioners on the ground leading up to the launch of the book. So this is definitely not a moment. This is a movement, and we intend for this to be a journey that we'd like to take together. So with that, I want to invite folks to one more opportunity to just sign up for information. And here's a QR code so that you can stay informed about the upcoming workshops, the podcast, some of the videos that I just mentioned, and the book launch. We're probably going to run a special for discounts for the book, et cetera, et cetera. So if you haven't yet, please go to that. You see the QR code as well as the URL, and we want to invite folks to stay connected. Thank you so very much, my friends, my tribe. Thank you for holding me up, for joining us together today, for being part of this journey together. My good friend, one of my older friends, Brother Steve Booth, I see your comment here. Is there a list of suggested books or lectures included in your newest work? There is. There will be a set of books so we can study along together that'll be listed in the book. But in the meantime, we're going to probably release that as one of those drips that'll come out leading up to the book as well. Steve, I know you as being a leader in my life to make sure that we do the research. We got to do the research. And so thank you for reminding me of the importance of that. So with that, everyone, thank you so very much. We appreciate your time, and let's get about this work. Thank you.